thick that they could almost stop his boat, really, really thick. He came back and reported what he had done, what he had found to the king, but he founded a new country himself. The king sent him back, but Cabot and his crew were never seen or heard from again. Again, one of those cases, I mean, this happened a lot. Probably a storm came up where the ship might have been old and fell apart. There was a case one time where two ships were going to the New World, and one of them watched one night as one of them still had its lights lit, its oil lamps, but watched as it went under. Nothing the one ship could do about it. It's just
You said you found that, what you said?
Newfoundland. He founded Newfoundland. Yeah, he called it Newfoundland, which English word means Newfound. He called it the Newfoundland. Yeah, it's an English word, Newfoundland. The Vikings, I think, called it something else. But anyway, John Cabot was never heard from again. Amerigo Vespucci sailed, and I'm just going to write his first name. Again, the standard view is that America was named after him, Amerigo Vespucci. There is a report, though, that the Templars told the King of Scotland in the 1300s, oh, we buried our treasure in the land of America across the sea. That the land was called America long before Vespucci, and that Amerigo Vespucci, the land was not named after him. But anyway, the idea that the land of America was named after Amerigo Vespucci has stuck, that it should have been called Columbia. There is a nation called Columbia. As for the Viking, as far as the Templar treasure, people have spent a lot of time and money looking for it. There is evidence that the Templars did come over here in the 1300s. We have found Templar artifacts. The Templars were a European order of knights. All right. People still didn't know if what Columbus had found was a new land, which some people suspected, or was in fact joined to Asia. Well, a man named Magellan, with a crew of 300 men, sailed all the way around South America, and then went up across the Pacific Ocean. Magellan himself was killed by the Filipinos. The Filipinos were barbaric and wild and headhunters, among other things, and eventually it took the Europeans to go in and conquer them. Either that or leave them alone, I mean, one or the other. But anyway, the Filipinos killed him, but 18 of the 300 and some men that started him landed in Spain. It took him 3 years. Some 3 years after they started, only 18 came back, and they were very weak and sickly. They kissed the ground when they arrived. They bowed down and kissed the ground. A lot of soldiers returning from the war will do that. Anyway, Magellan proved that what Columbus had discovered was actually a new land that had not been known about. That the North and South America was not the Far East. Now you have other explorers. Before we get to explorers, though, the Spanish heard a rumor that there was a rich kingdom in Mexico. So a man named Cortez, let's see, no. Cortez took something like 200 or 300 men, and when he got to the coastline of Mexico, he burned his ships. Just like Julius Caesar many years before had burned his bridges, Julius Caesar said to him, as they crossed the bridge, burn this bridge, we're either going to conquer Rome or we're going to die, but we're not going to be satisfied, we're not going to run, we're not going to go back. Cortez burned his ships. He said, we're either going to conquer Mexico or we're going to die, but we're not going to go back. So Cortez burned his ship. Now, in the meantime, Cortez found a young slave woman who had passed around from one tribe to another and had the gift of learning languages. She picked up on the Spanish language easily. Some people have a knack for learning languages. Others, like myself, don't, but that's another issue. But anyway, She learned Spanish really fast, and she served as an interpreter. Cortez met Montezuma, the leader of the Aztecs. Cortez met Montezuma, and at first her meeting was friendly. Now, folk, I always at this point ask the class a question. If you had been Cortez, or if you had been part of his army, 300 or some men, and you heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the temple. All right, this actually happened, folk. I'm talking about real. Cortez heard from the temple a bunch of really hideous screams coming. So he asked, what's the meaning of these screams? And he was told, oh, these are people being sacrificed to the sun, to our sun god, Quetzalcoatl. And they will be, basically they're being fed to the sun god to keep the sun god shining. Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods, but devils. So the interpreter interpreted that. On both sides there came some tense moments, but then some peacekeepers came in on both sides, and they kind of smoothed things over. If you had been with Cortez and heard the screams, what would you have done? In a minute, maybe some of you might know, but I'll tell you what Cortez did. Modern day political correctness does not have an answer to this. As far as I know, modern day political correctness would say, well, who are we to say that one culture is better? No, let's be multicultural. Let them practice human sacrifice they want to. Let them do their own thing. That's their way of living, and let them alone. Cortez felt differently about it. He put a stop to it. It was not easy. Ultimately, Cortez left Montezuma. Well, he took on Montezuma prisoner, but then he was forced out because Montezuma's men rose up. He and his interpreter, this woman who he used as an interpreter, went around persuading the rest of the Mexican people who were not Aztecs to rebel. He didn't have any trouble doing this because the Aztecs would take Mexican women who were not Aztec and use them as sex slaves. And over basically when a tax collector came to your home, he could take anything he wanted, including your food, your women, your whatever, your children, anything he wanted, and go back, and nothing you could do about it. Again, maybe you think that all cultures are the same, multiculturalism. Who's to say one culture is any different from another? Who's to say one culture is better than another? Cortez did not believe that this culture was as good as his. He did not believe their religion was as good as his. He went back with an army, and after a series of bloody fights, initially Cortez was defeated and had to withdraw. But he figured out how to protect himself as the way the Indians did. He won. He overthrew the Aztec Empire, killed Montezuma, and then he enslaved friend and foe alike. Tried to forcibly convert, stop the human sacrifices. Again, I'm not going to say that he was wrong. You had two unequal cultures that met one day, and one of them was going to be swallowed up by the other one. The two of them could not get along. All right, I heard, every once in a while I hear something that I spend months thinking about. One of my Jewish pupils, I know we're in a Jewish community here, and there's a Jewish synagogue nearby. One of my Jewish pupils one day loaned me a tape, back when cassette tapes were popular. I had a cassette player in both of my cars. Don't have them anymore, the South style. But anyway, this was a few years back, and I'll never forget something I heard on one of the cassette tapes. The Jews claim that they're descended from Jacob. Some of you might know this. And Jacob had a twin brother named Esau. And Jacob was accused of stealing the birthright from his twin brother. But here's what this Jewish rabbi said. He said, when you're Jacob and you have a brother like Esau, everything you can do is wrong. Everything you will do is going to be wrong. When you're Cortez and you meet Montezuma, everything that's going to happen is going to be wrong. If you think you can live in peace, you're not awake to the world of reality. I appreciate it. I think most of you are listening. If you're afraid to comment, I'm afraid to comment. If you don't like what I just said, I got news for you. I don't like what I just said either. But I feel like I have to say it. The American Indians destroyed themselves as all empires do before outsiders came in and finished what they had started to do themselves. That was true of the Roman Empire, that was true of the Babylonian Empire, the Greeks, the Assyrians. Every empire that has fallen from within. The Aztec Empire fell from within before outsiders came in and finished off what they had started to do. Folk, until about 120 years ago, conquest was looked on as a virtue. European nations felt like they had a right and a duty to conquer other peoples, to civilize them, to Christianize them. Commerce, see, 3 C's, commerce, civilization, and Christianity. They had a duty. Then conquest became a nasty thing to do. It's something we don't do anymore. The people who haven't conquered their neighbors oftentimes regret it because their neighbors come in and conquer them. Just ask the Chinese. The Chinese were conquered by the Mongolians once, conquered by the Manchurians once, conquered by their barbarian neighbors. All right, I've gotten it off my chest. I'll move on. Pizarro now went down and conquered the Incas. The Incas had a lot of gold. How much gold? The room that they half filled up was the size of a classroom. They filled it up as high as they could reach. The Inca chieftain was a pretty tall man. So imagine this room being filled up as high as a tall man can reach, half full of gold. This gold was carried to Spain, where it, for half of a generation, enriched the Spanish. Whoops. And then the Spanish lost it all. It found its way all over the rest of Europe, which is typical of what happens to persons who become suddenly rich. They lose it. Inflation was a big problem in Spain. Maybe you don't know what inflation is, but if you went through Jimmy Carter's term like I did, inflation where it cost a dime this year and $1 the next, the same thing. That's exaggerated a little bit. Actually, real inflation is where it costs $1 this year, $1.25 the next, $1.50 after that, and $2 the next year after that. But your pay does not match the inflation rate. So you go deeper and deeper in the hole. That's inflation. They hit the Spanish. I'll go into more detail in the next chapter. Well, maybe later on in this chapter. Anyway, the Spanish, the Indians were enslaved. A lot of them. But the Indians didn't make good sense. Number one, the Indians knew the place, and they knew how to run and hide, knew where to go, where they would be found. So the Europeans began to import African slaves. The Africans could not run because they didn't know where to go. They'd get lost. And also, Africans had some immunity to diseases that the Indians did not have. The Africans had cattle, after all. They were somewhat immune to smallpox and typhus, much more so than the Indians were. All right. Now, Ponce de Leon, there's a street in Atlanta named after him. He explored Florida. Now, your book doesn't mention it, but the old books used to say he was looking for the fountain of youth. I don't know why your book does not mention that, but he believed he'd find a fountain one day that would turn him young again. So every time he came to a spring of water or a little pond, he'd ask his men to step aside. He would be the first one to stoop down and drink of it like a dog drinks. I mean, just take the water in without the benefit of his cup. It did not make him young. He finally was killed by Indians, but actually it is known he looked older after several years of exploring than he had when he started out. That's not surprising, all of us eventually do. Oh yes, now De Soto and Coronado looked for the 7 cities of Cibola. De Soto, he's the first European we know who's went to Georgia. Now, the 7 cities of Cibola were supposedly golden cities, 7 cities with streets of gold and very wealthy. They didn't exist. But the Spanish believed it. I wonder if there's not another wealthy country for us to conquer, as wealthy as the Aztecs and as wealthy as the Incas. There wasn't one. The Mayans were already in a state of decline. Now, meanwhile, what was going on in Europe? There was an attempt to reform Europe, reform Christianity. And I want to state this about reform, folk. Western Europe is about the only place on earth where you'll find that they had a period in history called a Reformation. Now, I talked to a man at Lockheed who was from another part of the world in Western Europe, and he did tell me, where I come from, we didn't have a Reformation. I couldn't bring myself to say to him, no, but you needed one. Everybody needs a Reformation. I've gone to high school reunions. In fact, I went to my 50th year high school reunion. They give out awards, and there's one award that they give out that I have never received and hope I never do. It's the award for least changed. Now, when I went to my 50th year reunion, we all had to wear name tags, because except for the ones of us who kept up with each other down through the years, none of us could recognize each other. None of us looked the way we did when we were 18. Afraid not. I don't. But anyway, when they put your tag on, you can see a little bit of resemblance. When you get older, you'll know what I mean. Just a little faint resemblance to what they once were. Oh yeah, I see where you are, Mike. Yeah, oh yeah, you're Steve. He had his name tag on. Yeah, I see the resemblance. Anyway, but, Reformation, back to Reformation. Martin Luther started a movement to try to reform the church. He couldn't. Now, eventually the church did reform itself. But Martin Luther could not reform the church, so Martin Luther finally decided to break away from the church. Well, Charles V vowed to stamp out Protestantism, so Charles V got his army together. The army was expensive. He could not win. His son Philip took up where Charles V had left off. Philip could not win. Philip II went bankrupt. So did some. How could the richest king of Europe? It's very easy. You go bankrupt, you keep spending more money than you take in. And believe me, even wealthy kings and even emperors can go bankrupt. 2 generations of Spanish kings, Philip II and his son, both went bankrupt. Here's something else they tried taxing the people. The taxes got heavy, but the nobility, the richer people, were exempt. Only the poor paid the taxes. Now this business of the nobles being exempt from taxes, this still went on as recently as when I was a little bit older than you are. Tax evasion was considered a privilege of the rich. And Queen Elizabeth II refused to pay taxes for many years, and she was a woman's room. And one day, one of her palaces caught fire and did about $900,000 worth of damage. And the people of England said, "We're not going to pay for it. You're the richest one. Will you pay for it out of your own pocket?" Which she did. She finally was told, "Your Majesty, you've got to pay taxes. She finally started paying taxes. Today, even the rich, the nobles, even the royalty pays taxes. But that was not true back then. So the tax burden destroyed Spain, and Spain became impoverished and has remained impoverished till the year 2019. in Europe, there were 5 countries that bring down Europe's economy. They're sometimes called the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Ireland, that's P-I-I, Greece, and S, Spain, P-I-I-G-S. They do a lot to bring down the rest of the economy of Europe. All right. Sir Walter Raleigh tried to start a colony in North Carolina. A baby was born named Virginia Dare. The colony failed. When they came back to the colony, after being gone for a while, they found that it was all gone. And to this day, we don't know what happened to the colony, the speculation. I could go into more detail, but I'm kind of running out of time. And also, the speculations have not been proven. But the most likely, it was they either overrun by disease or by Indians, or a combination of both, or starvation. Starvation, disease, Indians, combination of all 3 might have wiped out the colony. So the first colony failed, but now I want to state this for the record. The oldest city in the United States that was founded by Europeans is not English. It's in Florida, St. Augustine. Founded in 1590, 17 years before the Jamestown colony. The oldest permanent English settlement, that is at last, it was Jamestown. Founded in 1607. I'm not going to write the date down. Founded in 1607, that's the, I have to qualify, that's permanent and English. To qualify, the first permanent English settlement was Jamestown. With that, I'm moving on to chapter 3, and I don't have 30 minutes left. All right, your book opens up chapter 3 with a little vignette. The story goes that John Smith was taken by the Indians. He was taken into Powhatan, before Powhatan, and a bunch of Indian men brought in a bunch of clubs and a bunch of rocks with which they were supposed to beat out John Smith's brains. At least that's what John Smith saw. So they laid John Smith down. And at the last minute, a young 10-year-old girl, your book says 11-year-old, whatever, named Pocahontas, who was the chief's daughter, Powhatan's daughter, came in, stepped down, and threw her body on John Smith and begged him, her father, to spare his life. We don't doubt that this actually happened. But what we now think that Pocahontas was doing, and Powhatan too, was enacting a ritual in which John Smith and all of his followers were being adopted into Powhatan's tribe. Now, there have been, Pocahontas is one of the most famous women in American history. And there have been many a book written by her and some movies. Now, when my 2 daughters were young girls, they watched the movie, and we bought the video of Pocahontas. They pictured a romance between Pocahontas and John Smith, which actually never occurred. John Smith was 28 when he met Pocahontas, and she was only 10 or 11. Even though Pocahontas eventually married John Wolfe, who was much younger than John Smith. But that came later. Also, the movie showed Pocahontas converting John Smith to animism. This didn't happen. The English looked on the Indian religion as being primitive. Instead, Pocahontas converted to Christianity. Your book makes it seem like it was a forced conversion, but I really think the conversion was genuine. Anyway, Pocahontas married, had a son. Today, millions of Americans claim that they are descended, and some of them can prove it. They're descended from Pocahontas and John Wolfe. And there's one son, Thomas Wolfe. All right, that's the opening vignette. Now, John Wolfe is famous, would be famous even if it weren't for Pocahontas. He mixed 2 strains of tobacco together. Basically, he was following Europeans' pattern of making a science out of farming. So he grafted in 2 strains of tobacco to get a new strain. And this new strain had what you call hybrid vigor. In other words, it was a better breed of tobacco than anything that had been grown before. And the result was tobacco became a big cash crop and was to remain so until fairly recent times. And still is largely. It's still a money crop. Now, in In 1607, a bunch of men came and settled in Jamestown, and folk, it was probably the absolute worst place in North America they could have found. It was a swamp. The swamp bred mosquito. Well, the swamp did not breed the mosquitoes, but basically, I hope you know what I mean. The swamp was a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And they did not realize that at the time. The water was half salt water and half fresh water, therefore very difficult to drink and very foul. Malaria was a common disease among them. If they would have been smarter, they should have settled up in Massachusetts, where a bunch of English people settled later. What's so great about Massachusetts? Aren't the winters long and cold? Yes, but the long, cold winters kill the mosquitoes and kill the bugs and kill the germs that cause disease, and the people up there live longer. Anyway, they started their colony in Jamestown. The colony did not do well for many, many years. Finally, the government took over, and this is one time when the government taking over appears to have been the right move. The colony became better. Now, one problem the colony had, a lot of the men who came over came to hunt gold. They were what we call gentlemen, and gentlemen in the old world did not work. They considered that, hey, we are of the higher classes, the lower caste people work, but we don't. Also, some of them were blacksmiths, and they wouldn't do anything but blacksmithing. Some were tanners, and they wouldn't do anything but tan hides. And for a while, the colony starved. The Indians would help them a little bit. Now, there was a documentary done, about 15 or so years ago, that appeared on the History Channel, that said that when they dug up the bodies a few years back, they found that a lot of these men in there had been arsenic poisoned, and they have no idea who would have poisoned them with arsenic, but it could not have been the Indians. They didn't have any arsenic. Somebody was poisoning the food of these colonials, and it was killing them in droves. Again, we don't know why. Eventually, John Smith took over the colony. Captain John Smith. And he told the gentlemen, you will work. And he told the blacksmiths, you'll do what we tell you to, because we don't need a blacksmith here right now. We need a farmer. You're going to start working with a hoe. And he quoted, he said, he who will not work will not eat. He was quoting the Apostle Paul, who also said the same thing. Let the person who doesn't work not eat. That sounds hard. That is also anti-socialistic. Communism says feed everybody whether they work or not. They're entitled. John Smith said, if you don't work, I'm not going to feed you. Nobody is entitled here. Of course, some of them were too sick to work. Powhatan, who is Pocahontas' father, never tried to wipe out the colony, but when he died, his brother Opechecano took over. Opechecano got the Indians under his command together and started a killing rampage, and they killed about a third of the colonists. But the surviving colonists got together and they defeated Opechecano and his men. I don't want to call them an army, but I will say his braves, his warriors, call them whatever. He defeated them. Opechecano was killed. So the Virginia colony now drove the Indians farther west. Now here was the catch-22. This was the first of many things like this that was to happen. They said to the Indians, now you live on this side of the boundary, and we will stay over here, and you can live there. Sounds like a good deal, except for one thing. Like all the deals that were made like this, it didn't work. The white man kept coming in. He ran out of land, so he moved into Indian land, and the government was not powerful enough to stop him. And this was to go on for the next 300 or 400 years. Anyway, the House of Burgesses was set up. This was the beginning of democracy in America. Burgess, I think I misspelled that word. Let me see. B-U-R-G-E, House of Burgess, okay, B-U-R-G-E-S-S, yeah.